Good evening, everyone, and good morning. Joining from America and in Europe. I'm really happy to see you again at this training program. Today, we'll be going to talk about trade in goods, and Mr. Patrick MACRORY, who is a barrister and also an international lawyer, the head of International Trade Center at the International Law Institute, Washington, D.C., will be talking about the core principles of trade in goods and the non-discrimination practices, the MFN concept, the national treatment. I'm sure he'll be also focusing on tariffs, transparency, and then for the next session, he's again joining us talking about the exceptions in trade in goods and different principles, and we'll be talking from an international perspective to give you a better overview and understanding of the same. Feel free to put your questions in the question and answer box, and we'll be moderating those. I'll ask my colleague, Mr. Robert Sargent, who's the Deputy Director of International Law Institute, to see if we can have a small open session for you all to discuss and ask questions in person. So we will also keep you updated about that. So again, I wish you a very wonderful session. And Patrick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Manoj, and good evening to you in India from this rather strange country at the moment. We don't know what's happening. We're in limbo, but that's obviously another story. Perhaps by the time this course ends in 3 weeks' time, perhaps we'll have a better idea of where things are going, and we certainly hope so. I'm sorry, one or two people commented yesterday that I was speaking too quickly, and I've had that problem before. I was once in Korea giving a speech in a very formal setting with a separate booth for the interpreters, and I suddenly noticed the interpreters were waving frantically at me because I was going too fast and they couldn't keep up. So I will do my best to slow down, and again, just tell me again if I'm going too quickly. One of the when people who are not familiar with the trade scene, and I believe that some of you probably are coming into it, not necessarily for the first time, but certainly you're fairly new to it. There are a lot of technical terms and abbreviations and acronyms. And one that came up yesterday when Warren was talking about free trade agreements was TPA, or Trade Promotion Authority. And this will undoubtedly come up again throughout the course. And I thought it might be helpful just to spend 5 minutes explaining what TPA is. And it's something that arises from the peculiar structure of the United States. As you know, we are not a parliamentary system. The chief executive is not the person who has the most votes in parliament and therefore could basically get anything done within reason that he or she wants to get done. We, as you know, have separation of powers. And in terms of trade, the power is separated between our legislature and the president. And as you'll see from this slide, the president is given authority by the Constitution to negotiate treaties. So the president or his people, the executive branch, they go out, the US Trade Representative negotiates international trade agreements. However, Congress has the authority to regulate trade. So you've got this sort of dual feature here, which does make life a lot more complicated for the United States when it's trying to enter trade agreements. Now, it is true that Congress delegates much of the authority to the executive. Congress is not equipped to handle dumping or countervailing duty cases, for example, or indeed to negotiate treaties. So it goes back and forth. There's a constant tug of war between the executive and Congress. To give you an example, the area where I've worked mostly is anti-dumping and countervailing duties. When I started in this area nearly 50 years ago, the statute on dumping and countervail took up about 1 page. Basically, the Congress said, okay, you do it. We give you lots of authority, do what you want. And then Congress decided they weren't doing a good job. They were not protecting US industry the way the Congress wanted. And so they've gradually changed the law, they've added to it. And now those two laws occupy about 50 pages. So they've said in great detail, Congress has said in great detail, this is how we want you to apply the law. So this goes back and forth all the time. Now, oops, I'm sorry. I went too far. Okay. Sorry, I don't know. Wait a minute. Okay, I think I see how to do this. Yeah, okay. Now, as I'm sure you know, whenever a bill is introduced into Congress by a member or by the president, it goes to a committee, the relevant committee. Trade matters go to the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee. Now, Congress or the committee can refuse to act on the bills at all. They can just bottle them up. The chairman, as again, okay, thanks. As you know, Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, basically said he was going to block anything Obama tried to get through. And we may have a similar situation if the Republicans maintain a hold on the Senate. So the first few trade negotiating rounds, we talked about those yesterday, starting in Geneva and then Torquay and a few others. Basically, those were simply tariff cutting agreements. And Congress ahead of time gave the president authority to cut tariffs by, I think it was up to 50%. So that was fine. The negotiators had authority to negotiate reductions in tariffs. But then in the Kennedy round in the 1960s, the negotiators went a little further, and they reached two agreements. One actually had to do with anti-dumping, and the other had to do with a very protectionist customs valuation provision in US law, which resulted in very high tariffs on certain products. So the negotiators got together and the US said, all right, we'll give up this customs valuation provision that you don't like, but we want something in return. And so France agreed that it would drop a very high tariff on large cars, which obviously affected American cars. So that was fine. But then the negotiators came back, the US negotiators came back to report to Congress, and they said, yes, we've got these wonderful tariff reductions. It's really going to help our exporters. We're going to really do well. And by the way, there were these two little agreements that we agreed to, but I'm sure you're fine with that. And Congress said, we did not give you authority to do that. We absolutely refused to agree to the necessary changes in the law. And so the US was put in a very awkward position. France had already done what it had agreed to do. It had lowered the tax on large cars, and the US was unable to fulfill its side of the bargain. Well, imagine that in the next negotiating round, you are a US negotiator. How much authority do you have, or how much credibility do you have? Because Congress can do the same. They can say, right, we don't like what you agreed to, and so we're not going to agree to it. So the deal was in 1974, this was in preparation for the Tokyo round. It was known as a fast track, but now it's got a more formal name, Trade Promotion Authority. And basically, Congress says, well, we will change our rules. Instead of having the power to amend or to block a trade agreement that you've reached, we agree that we will act, we won't bottle it up, and we'll vote it up or down without amending. In other words, we won't have changes on the floor of the House or the Senate. It will, and in fact, that worked very well. That gave the US negotiators much more credibility. There would be a vote. It would be up or down. It could be down, but in fact, it never has been. And it worked for the Tokyo round, the Uruguay round, and most free trade agreements. Now, the important point is that it's time limited. Congress passes the Trade Promotion Authority for a certain length of time, a few years. And there was the Korean Free Trade Agreement. The negotiating authority ran out on, I think it was June the 30th, on whichever year it was. And the final agreement was signed at 1 a.m. the next day in Seoul. So this is a bit of a problem. It was out of time. But then somebody had the bright idea, why don't we use Washington time, which of course was still before midnight. So that's what you see. There's a lot of negotiating backward and forward. And traditionally now, the president submits a bill, but not formally. And there's negotiation before the bill is formally introduced. And as I said, it's been quite effective, but it is a result of our rather unusual constitutional setup. And by the way, the US sometimes find it very useful in negotiations because they do the bad cop, good cop. The USTR negotiators, somebody makes a suggestion in the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement. Canada wanted elimination of dumping, countervailing duty laws. They said they don't belong in a free trade agreement. And there's certainly a good argument that on the text of the GATT, you should not have dumping or countervail. Well, the USTR people in the negotiations said, yes, of course we understand, you're totally reasonable. But Congress, they'll never agree. So Congress can play the bad cop. It's quite effective as a negotiating tool. Okay, so much for that. Now I want to get back into the GATT, and I have to figure out how to get the next.
Patrick, while we're transitioning, there was one question that came up.
Yeah.
It asks, what happens if Congress refuses to give the president TPA?
Well, then the president can't negotiate. He has really no negotiate. Well, now let me back off that. The president could negotiate a free trade agreement, but the problem is that without TPA, it can be amended by Congress, or it can just be blocked by Congress. Now, there have been one or two trade agreements which were reached without TPA. President Clinton lost TPA for several years, and the US-Jordan free trade agreement did go through without TPA, but the point was that was totally uncontroversial. There's no American manufacturer who's afraid of imports from Jordan. I mean, it's a tiny amount of trade. Jordan was, again, I think I mentioned this yesterday, we were basically rewarding our friends. Jordan obviously has been a huge ally for us in the Middle East. They reached an agreement with Israel, and so we're rewarding them, but in terms of trade. But if it was a big trade agreement like Korea, there's no way it would go through without a lot of amendments. I hope, does that answer the question?
I will suspect yes.
Okay.
You do have another question on technology, but I'll answer that after your morning session.
Okay. No, I'm sorry, Bob. I need to know how to get the next slide show. I need help. Sorry. I need the GATT. That doesn't matter. I apologize. As you can tell, I'm technologically challenged. It's in the other group. Where is it? GATT.
This one here?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's that one here. Okay, so now we will turn to the GATT, which is, as you know, I think from yesterday, it is really the core, the key provisions, and it's still very important. I want to say a few more words, which I didn't say yesterday, about the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And I think I mentioned yesterday that it was basically meant to be a temporary agreement reached in 1947 by 23 countries. And the idea was, while the International Trade Organization was moving forward, but that would have to be ratified by the legislatures of each country. And this would take time, probably 2 or 3 years. Meanwhile, these 23 countries said, let's get the world economy, let's give it a kickstart by lowering tariffs and getting more trade. And so that's all it was meant to be, was a temporary agreement. Now, there were some peculiarities about it. It actually never formally came into effect, which is rather remarkable because the GATT operated for 40 years, arranging trade negotiations, doing dispute settlement, handling that, and yet it was never formally ratified. It provided that when countries representing 85% of world trade ratify or agree, then it will go into effect. Well, the fact is that only 2 countries ever formally agreed to the GATT. They were Haiti and Liberia. I don't know what percentage of world trade they accounted for, but I think we can be fairly certain that it wasn't 85%. So it was a very strange creature. It was never an institution. If you went to Geneva from 1947 to 1995, you would find a building and you'd find people there, and it was called the GATT, but it was never had a legal entity. There was no such thing. There was no legal institution or organization called the GATT. It was just this simple agreement. And I always liked the fact that right up until 1994, the 95, who paid the rent on the building and who paid the salaries of the staff? Well, it was actually the Interim Commission on the International Trade Organization. The ITO, as I mentioned yesterday, died because the United States refused to ratify, but there was still an interim commission, part of the United Nations, for 40 years. And so that it was a very strange thing. It was never intended to be more than just a very short term, 2 to 3 year agreement. But with a lot of ingenuity, it actually managed to create itself into something that looked very much like an organization, but actually did not have that legal status. And what is really important is that although as an organization, the GATT, or quasi-organization, it no longer exists. It's been replaced by the WTO, which has full legal, it's a legal entity, it's part of the UN, and so on. But nevertheless, the GATT as an agreement is still in effect. It's the core of the trade obligations, and as we'll see, it absolutely permeates. And to give you an idea of how important it is, of the around 500 complaints that have been filed with the dispute settlement system since the 1995, when the WTO came into effect, about 3/4 of them have involved alleged GATT violations. Now, they may allege other violations of other agreements, but the GATT itself is very much the core. It's really important to understand. And the GATT is part of the group of WTO agreements, which we looked at briefly yesterday, and we'll be looking at more this week. Okay, so what are the core principles? You probably know many of these. Non-discrimination. If you remember from yesterday, Cordell Hull felt very strongly that discrimination in trade terms led to conflict, led to war, and we looked at a couple of examples. Pearl Harbor, a war started as a result of a trade restriction, Ukraine, and then of course the EU was designed to prevent war by linking the economies of particularly France and Germany in a way that would make it very difficult to go to war. And indeed, as again I mentioned, President Wilson, in his 14 points that were the basis for the settlement of the World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, non-discrimination was very much a part of that. So non-discrimination breaks down into two elements. We'll be looking at these in a lot more detail. Most favored nation, which is basically you treat imports and exports from all countries that are members or a party to the GATT in the same way. There are important exceptions, which we'll see. And then national treatment, which basically is once a good is imported, comes into the country, it must be treated at least as well as domestic goods of the same type. Tariffs are the only form of restriction on imports that are allowed. Quantitative restrictions or quotas, in other words, numerical limits, they are basically banned. There are always exceptions, by the way, to every rule, but these are the basic rule is only tariffs. Then we have a concept called tariff bindings. There's no requirement in the GATT that countries lower their tariff to particular levels. It's completely optional. It's a negotiation. But the idea is that once you have agreed to a certain tariff level in a negotiation, then you are bound, that's a technical term, and you cannot go above it. You can go below it. And as we'll see, this happens a lot. And then finally, transparency. Simple idea, but very important. If you are a trader, you need to know if you want to export a product to a particular country, you need to know what the rules are. What's the tariff level? Can you sell over the tariff level, or will it eat into too much into your profits? So that's very important. It's not a complicated concept, but it is very important. Okay, so let's start with Article 1. So it shows how important they regarded this. The most favored nation. There's the language, any advantage, favor granted with respect to imports from or exports to. And note that we often think of most favored nation, non-discrimination in terms of imports, and that's often where it applies. But it also applies to exports. So in other words, you can't discriminate if you are exporting. You must treat all countries equally. And then a very important term is like product. What does that mean? We'll get into this in some detail. It's a critical part of trade because the rules apply to like products, but not to unlike products. There are a lot of cases that turn on like products. In looking at a trade issue, very often the first question is, are we dealing with like products? Is the imported product that is a concern, is that like the domestic product? And as I said, we look at this in more detail. Now, one thing that rather amusing, most favored nation, MFN, is the term in the agreement. But when it came to granting most favored nation treatment to China back in, I think, about 1989, I think, and as I mentioned, that was done by Congress. It was not part of, they didn't come into the WTO, but we gave them most favored, no, the GATT, we gave them most favored nation treatment. But people who are concerned about image in politics said, oh, we can't give most favored nation to China. That sounds as if we're giving preference to China. So for China, the term used is PNTR, permanent normal trade relations. For me, it doesn't have the ring of MFN, but I suppose that's because MFN's been around for a long time. But that's all about image. It is exactly the same. PNTR is exactly the same as MFN, but with China, we give it that different name. Okay. We usually think of most favored nation as applying to customs duties. In other words, you can't levy if we're importing, well, China's a bad example because we've got these extra duties. But for example, we would, if we don't have a free trade agreement, then we apply the same duty to imports of cars from Japan and imports from Europe, let's say, or Korea. Well, Korea is different because we have a free trade agreement. So customs duties, but also it applies to other areas, methods of levying duties and charges. In other words, how do you value? And we'll look at that when we get to customs issues later in the week. How do you value the goods? Because most duties are based on a percentage of value. So you have to use the same approach to imports from all countries that are entitled to MFN. Rules and formalities, the kind of paperwork that has to be done. You can't just waive that for countries that you like. And then rather importantly, internal taxation. If you have a VAT, which we don't, we have state sales taxes, but many countries have VAT, and I assume that's true in India. I should know. For example, the United States might have said during the Iraq War, well, Britain has sent troops to Iraq, they're our friends, so let's drop the VAT, let's drop that tax. But the French, I think they were known as cheese-eating surrender monkeys, and so we're going to apply it to them. That would not be legal under Article 1. Okay, so now let's look at this term, like product. As I said, it's a key term. It's been estimated to be used 47 times in WTO agreements, all the different agreements. And there's an early case on Spanish coffee. Spain, until the early 80s, had one tariff on coffee. But then they split it up. They divided it into 7 categories like Robusta, Arabica, and 2 of them had 0 duty, and 5 had a 7% duty. I think the previous tariff had been about 4%, something like that. So basically they're separating it out. Now you might ask, why did they do that? Was that for trade reasons? Were they trying to discriminate against countries which are in the 0 duty category or in favor of them and discriminate against the 7%? No, it had nothing to do with that. It had to do with inflation, which was very high then. And coffee apparently represented about 2% of the consumer price index. And so the Spanish government wanted to encourage people to drink the cheaper coffee, and they put a zero duty on the cheaper coffee and higher on the 7%. So it had nothing to do with trade, but it had a trade impact. Brazil was shipping mostly coffee in the high 7% category, and so they brought a case against Spain. So the question was, can you divide coffee up into different like products? And Spain, of course, said, well, of course they're different products. Everybody knows the difference between Arabica and Robusta. They're grown in different climates. They have a different taste. Any connoisseur can tell the difference. Well, think about that. Do you think that was a valid distinction? The GATT panel, which decided the case, said no, coffee is coffee is coffee. Yes, there are differences, but they're not significant. Coffee basically has one function as a drink. But you can get into some very interesting philosophical debates. For example, are oranges and apples like products? They have the same purpose, the same end use. They're eaten by people. But I would certainly think they're not a like product because one is a citrus fruit, one is not. But what about oranges and lemons? Now you're talking citrus, or oranges and tangerines, fairly close in terms of taste. Or what about vodka and gin? They're not that different. Or hard and soft cheese, or dairy cows and beef cows. So these issues come up again and again in these cases.
Patrick,
Yeah.
if I may, I apologize for interrupting. We have three similar questions, I suppose, questions regarding like products in the GATT. If maybe we can address those, and then I'll ask any additional questions later on.
Sure.
First of all, the question is like product defined in WTO?
Good question. No, it's not. Now, it is defined, the wonderful definition in the US anti-dumping law. Like product is a product which is like, or in the absence of like, most similar. I'm sure you find that very, very helpful. But there is no definition as such in the GATT.
Okay. So how to determine like products for non-discrimination purposes? What is the conclusive criteria?
I'm going to come to that. The issue comes up more often when we're dealing with national treatment, and I've got some slides on that, and we'll discuss it. But it's a great question. But there are certain factors that the panels or the appellate body, when it's functioning, will look at, and we'll get into that.
Okay. And slightly different take on GATT. How can claims be based on the GATT if it has not been ratified?
That's a great question. That's a very good question. Well, countries have accepted the GATT, and it didn't have to be ratified because it was simply an agreement to cut tariffs. It wasn't setting up an organization or even, so, but it's a great question. I've never really thought about that, and I will think about that as part of my homework.
Okay, and my last question regarding this subject, and then I'll allow you to jump back in, and I'll be quiet.
I'm really getting at the interaction. It's terrific. I encourage it.
Right. Can claims be brought by individuals before the GATT, or must they be brought by states?
Very good question, and absolutely, it must be brought by states. Individual companies or individuals have no standing to bring cases in the GATT or the WTO now. Now, the only provision is that, I don't know if you use the term in India, amicus briefs, but where there's an important case, people who are interested sometimes file briefs. It might be a non-governmental organization or a trade association, and that is allowed in the WTO dispute settlement system, although my understanding is that the panel and the appellate body members never even read the brief, so there's not much point. I don't think they're used very much, but that's the only way that a private organization can express its views to the deciding authority. But basically, no, you have to. One of the problems with bringing a case, you have to persuade your government to bring the case. We'll look at that more when we get to dispute settlement. But these are terrific questions, by the way.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, here's an interesting example, and I want test your knowledge. Normally, of course, when we're doing this, we're doing it live, so I can ask for your views on this, but think about this. And I should say that this is actually based on a treaty between Germany and Switzerland. Oceania is Germany, and Pacifica is Switzerland. But for some reason, when we're using these examples, we change the names. And this goes way back before the GATT. This is about 1900. So, but just imagine it's today when we have MFN in principle. Oceania charges a 10% tariff on cattle generally, but 5% on cattle that are reared at a spot at least 300 meters above sea level and spend at least 1 month at least 800 meters above sea level. What a curious definition. I wonder who that is aimed at. Well, it's very obvious, isn't it? That's Switzerland. I don't think there's any other country, certainly in Europe, where those criteria apply. So the question is that consistent with most favored nation? And think about that for a moment, and then we'll explain. The issue is this important, critical issue of like product. Is a cow that is reared, that meets these criteria, is it like a cow that's, let's say, raised in Holland, which is actually below sea level? Is it like? And that's the question. If they're like products, if the general other cattle are like the cattle raised in Switzerland, as we know it's Switzerland, then you have a problem. You are charging a different duty on imports of a like product from different countries. I don't know. I mean, it's possible the Swiss cows are all dairy cows and the Dutch cows are beef cows. Are they like products? I don't know. And that's never been adjudicated. But this, I just want to give you the idea of how important like product is. If they're not like products, then this is fine. And you know, what if they're different species of cattle? But anyway, just again, it's a good illustration. Now, are there exceptions to most favored nation? Most favored nation? There certainly are. Free trade agreements. And again, you know, looked at these yesterday, but basically a free trade agreement is not consistent with MFN. You know, at this point, we give duty-free treatment to Australia, but not to New Zealand. And so that is legal under the GATT and under the WTO, but it is clearly not consistent with MFN. And as we know, regional trade agreements are now burgeoning, particularly with RCEP. RCEP alone is, I think, represents 25 to 30% of world trade. And certainly the other big ones, the African Free Trade Agreement, TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So much more than half of world trade is now not subject to MFN. It's subject to, you know, the other, I'm sorry, we should be on the next slide, preferential treatment. As again, I'm sure you know, there are various preferential arrangements under which developed countries give preferential treatment to developing countries. The, excuse me, the sort of more universal one is the generalized system of preferences, which India has benefited from, although some has been taken away recently. But that's, again, that is giving, the US gives zero duties on products that are subject to GSP. Europe gives preferential treatment, lower tariffs. And so, again, that's a huge exception.
Can I add something to that? And can I ask you a question?
Please.
So when we are talking about trade in goods, we can't obviously leave this forum without talking about India and China. And I would like to understand it from you, and I'm sure the participant would also like to understand that a country like India, let me tell you one very interesting fact or like figure, that bilateral trade between China and India was worth around 88 billion US dollars in the fiscal year ending March 2019.
I'm sorry.
Trade,
sorry, Manish, could you just say the number again?
It's 88 dollars, 88 billion US dollars actually.
Sorry, is that two-way trade or one-way?
I think it's it's two-way trade, bilateral trade.
Yeah, total. Okay.
It was like in 2019, and with China's like trade deficit of 53.5 billion in China's favor, which is like the widest India has with any country. But India says like very recently, India is planning to put tariffs on around 300 goods, 300 products, or like some category of goods in that sense. So talking about from the perspective of a customer who is benefiting and having a choice of choosing different goods, like the cheaper ones, like those who can't afford the expensive ones, how like how the country should think about it to deal with this kind of issues, obviously with the malpractices these nations are trying to do sometimes, like dumping and all. So that's one of my first question. And you talked about GSP, like India was there included in the GSP list. Did tariffs was like was hurting US, and that's why US took out India from the GSP list. So how to deal with that? And obviously President Trump, when he was here in India on his visit to Gujarat, he in a lighter mood said that India is a champion in terms of raising tariffs. So how India, like how international market sees India, especially US sees India when it comes to tariffs, and how Indian authorities, like would be a suggestion from your side that how India should design tariffs in a way that we should not lose special treatments like GSP and all. So what could be an approach for that? That's
Yeah, I assume we'll hear more on this from the Indian experts who will be talking next week and the following week. I mean, my understanding is that the US has said, look, there are things that you, India, are doing to our exports, which we don't like. And so we're going to take away GSP. And I assume, and I don't frankly know what the current status is, that there will be some sort of negotiation and some sort of agreement. I think there have been negotiations so that India could get GSP back if it agrees to whatever the US demands are about opening its markets. You know, in terms of what can you do, say, about imports from China, a big question. Obviously, you've got anti-dumping and countervail, and you probably know, and we'll get to this when we get to trade remedies, India is the most prolific user of anti-dumping laws of any country in the WTO. It's quite remarkable, and so on. But the other thing, which I'm going to come to a little later this morning, has to do with tariffs and tariff bindings. The actual tariffs that India is levying, the so-called applied rate, what is actually levied at the border, is much lower than the so-called bound rate, which is what India agreed to in trade negotiations. And India could, at any time, without any penalty whatsoever, raise its tariffs to the bound level. And I'm always surprised that doesn't happen more, because this is true most developing countries. But let me put that on one side, because I've got some slides on this a little later on. Okay. Does that, to some extent?
Yes, absolutely. So Patrick, like from my understanding of international trade and like the practice I have like in the area of international trade, what I can say is, and with all due respect to the decision of Indian government, I would say like that the government is finally, I mean, talking about manufacturing-led exports, which is a good news. But in the same breath, it is getting increasingly protectionist on the trade front by increasing like customs duties and planning other measures. And this old, I would say, a cliche like be Indian, buy Indian is making a comeback, which is a good thing. But here the trouble is that wanting to increase exports and being increasingly protectionist at the same time does not work like together. It like work cross purposes. And I think that's the bad news also. But let's hear it from the Indian experts when they come on.
Yeah, well, just to that, you're absolutely right. And I think President Biden, President-elect Biden, is going to run into exactly the same problem. I think Warren talked about this yesterday, that on the one hand, I think everybody, most people agree, economists agree, that the more open your trade, the better you will be, you will grow faster and so on. That's very well established now. But the problem is that whenever you open to trade, there are losers. Some industries will not compete. The argument or the example I sometimes give is the shoe industry. Until 30, 40 years ago, there was a thriving shoe industry in New England, in the United States. Well, that's completely gone because labor costs are much higher in the United States, and shoemaking is quite labor intensive. It's hard to develop a robot to make a shoe, and it's gone to countries in Latin America, in Asia, which have much lower costs. Well, so you've got people who have spent their life making shoes, and suddenly there's nothing for them to do. What do? Well, the economists, and economists are very good at theory, say, well, maybe he can go to Seattle and get a job working for Bill Gates or for Boeing. Yeah, right. Not very practical, because this person is, say, 55, he has no other skills, he's got family, or she has got family in New England. So there's always going to be that problem. And of course, India is sort of torn in a way between the desire to grow, and has done incredibly well in terms of manufacturing goods. I mean, I was thinking I mean, India now owns most of the UK car industry. It's quite remarkable. But you've got the problem with agriculture. You've got huge numbers, hundreds of millions of very poor farmers. And how do you strike the balance? It's a very difficult problem. And obviously more and more countries are, well, obviously the United States has been quite protectionist in the last 4 years, and other countries the same way. So it's a almost insoluble. There have been suggestions by very well-known economists that somehow the industries that benefit from trade and do well, they export more because other countries have opened up to trade, they should be taxed in a way, and then the proceeds given to the people who've lost their jobs. And I should also say we do have a program called Trade Adjustment Assistance in the United States, under which somebody who can show that he or she has lost a job because of imports can get some kind of relief, health benefits and the like. And I don't think, obviously that's a cost to the government, and I don't know if there's anything like that in India. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. Okay, now this MFN concept comes up in other agreements, other parts of the GATT, the TBT, Technical Barriers to Trade, the GATS, which is the General Agreement on Trade and Services, that we will look at later on. Sorry, I realize I speeded up. I'm going to try to slow down, but it doesn't appear in other agreements because it doesn't really make much sense. If you think about SPS, these sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which deal with health measures, food, drink, and the like. Well, if you have an outbreak of mad cow disease in the UK, as we did a number of years ago, and the US bans imports of mad cows or beef from the UK, if it was applying MFN, if it had to apply MFN, it would put a ban on imports from Argentina and Australia, where there's no mad cow disease. So it would make no sense because the diseases and problems with food are very much regional in nature. And dumping and countervail, those deal with country by country. Now, national treatment, very important. Many, many more cases on national treatment than on MFN. And if you think about it, that makes sense because MFN, if we were discriminating, imposing higher imports, higher duties on imports of cars from Europe as opposed to Japan, there's no particular political reason why we would want to do that. In both cases, we're talking about foreign companies, and there's no particular reason, as I said, to discriminate between them. On the other hand, when we're talking about imports against domestic products, then we are certainly talking about political influence. Domestic industries have employees who have votes, and so Congress or your parliament listens to them. And so you see much more, and we'll see some ingenious ways in which countries try to get around the national treatment. Now, it's slightly more complicated than most favored nation. There really are sort of two levels. You may not impose a higher tax imports that are like domestic products. So if you have a like product, and we'll look into this in more detail in a few minutes as to how that's assessed, and no higher tax, it must not be higher. Now, where you've got something that is not a like product, but directly competitive or substitutable, a rather broader category, then you can't impose an appreciably higher tax. You could have a small difference, but not big, and we'll see how that works. And then for other regulations, other than taxes, safety regulations, pollution, etc., then like products only applies. I know that's a little complicated, but I hope that makes sense. Now, what are the factors that we look at? Basically, usually they look at four product properties. What is the product made of? What does it look like? What does it do? The end use, how is it used? And then consumer tastes and habits. What do consumers think about it? Do they think, for example, that gin and whiskey are similar enough that they would substitute one for the other? And then tariff classification. In the Spanish case, the Spanish coffee case, one of the factors that led the GATT panel to rule against Spain was that all other countries simply had a single classification, a tariff classification for coffee. So another, there was an interesting case against France on asbestos, which came from Canada mostly. And France put a ban on all products containing asbestos. And Canada was exporting a sort of building block which contained asbestos as a binding agent. Now, in France, they were producing an identical block, except it didn't use asbestos. It used some, I think, PVC as a binding agent. You couldn't tell the difference by looking at it. It had exactly the same purpose for building, and it had the same tariff. So unless you happen to know that it contained asbestos or didn't, then it's the same product. However, the appellate body said, well, that is an important difference. There's a health factor here. Some consumers would not buy the asbestos product. And so that is a factor in this particular case. I suppose you could say it falls within the rubric of consumer tastes and habits. There's a very interesting series of cases on liquor. And by the way, a lot of cases in the WTO and the GATT deal with alcohol. There are a lot of cases on beer, which we'll look at a bit later, and on liquor and other things. Curious. Somebody asked the question yesterday, a very good question about Mike. I think I mentioned this, my example of theoretical example of cars and wine, and they're both, in a sense, well, cars pollute and wine can be addictive. As I said, so many cases involving alcohol. Okay, so Japan. The first case was against Japan. This is a very early case in the new WTO. As some of you may know, shochu is a Japanese drink. It's clear, basically flavorless, and it's mainly a sort of a working class drink, and it's produced in Japan and sold there. Now, there was an excise tax on shochu, which was much lower than on vodka, gin, brandy, and whiskey, most of which was imported, although Japan does make good whiskey, and I assume they make vodka, gin, and brandy as well. Anyway, so the first question was, were they like products? And again, think about this. And the appellate body came out with an interesting decision. They said, well, vodka and gin really are, I'm sorry, shochu and vodka are really so similar that we can call them like products. They're both clear, they're flavorless, etc. So there we have a like product. We've got a difference in the excise tax, a very significant difference, by the way. And so that we do find to be a violation. But what about gin, brandy, and whiskey? Are they like products? No, they're different. They have different flavors. They're made from different ingredients. And you know, if you did a taste test, you'd certainly know the difference. But remember, if I can find out how to go backwards. Wait a minute. Sorry. My apologies. Okay, remember, Article 3, where we're dealing with taxes, doesn't just apply to like products, it applies to directly competitive or substitutable. Now, so then the question becomes, we've decided that gin, brandy, and whiskey are not like products, but are they directly competitive or substitutable? Think about that. And how would you decide that there was, in fact, some competitive overlap? Well, the US, who brought this case, I think Europe was also part of it, but certainly the US had some pretty good evidence, because from time to time, over the last 20 years or so, the relative tax had changed. The tax on shochu may have gone up a bit compared with the other products, or it might have gone down. But in each case, there was a shift in consumption. And that was pretty convincing evidence that there was, in fact, competitive overlap. And so the decision was that this was a violation of Article 3.2. There was a similar case against Korea. They had a similar difference. Now, Chile came up with what they thought was a very ingenious plan. And they said the tax will depend not on the nature of the product, of the liquor. It doesn't matter whether it's vodka or the equivalent, trying to remember the name of the Chilean, pisco, I think. That doesn't matter. The only thing that determines the rate of tax is the strength. Well, that looks fine. They said, okay, if it's 30%, a 30-degree proof, then whether it's produced in Chile or whether it's imported, it pays the same tax. So how can that be discrimination? Well, on its face, maybe they're right. But if you look at the actual numbers, the tax on anything 35 degrees or less was 27%, and only 4 degrees higher, it was 47%, rather a dramatic difference. And guess what the average strength of pisco was? Yes, it was 27% or below, and on the imported products, it was 47%. It was 47% tax on if it was 39 degrees or more. So a huge difference. And it was perfectly clear that, in fact, they were simply trying to avoid the implications of the Japanese case. And again, the appellate body found that there was a violation. There was another case against the Philippines, and you can see more and more ingenuity on the part of liquor producers and the appellate body going further and further. The next case was the Philippines. And the Philippines said, right, we're not going to base the tax on the strength of the product, because that didn't work. Chile lost that case. So we're going to the tax will depend on what the liquor is made of. And if it's local products like sugar cane, I'm sorry, there's a typo there, or coconuts, then that's a much lower tax than on cereals, potatoes, and corn. So does that get them anywhere? Well, again, the answer, the appellate body said, no, that doesn't work. Why? Because there was clear evidence of competition, and indeed, the fact that the Philippines called its locally made brandy Gran Matador, which sounds like Spain, or Britannia London Dry Gin, it was perfectly clear that they were competing, they were competitive with the imported. And so again, they lost the case. So you can see how broadly the appellate body has interpreted Article 3 and why it is very, very important. We teach every couple of 2 or 3 times a year a course on trade for the Foreign Service Institute, young American diplomats, and who are going out to post, and one of their jobs is to look for possible violations. I would say you're really focused on national treatment, because you're going to see many more schemes which are designed to favor domestic industries for obvious political reasons.
Patrick,
yeah,
I apologize. I know we're getting close to the end of this session. So I just wanted to make sure that I ask a few additional questions that have come up. If I can interrupt you, I apologize.
Yeah, sure. And then we'll take a short break.
Okay, great. So we have a number of them. So I'm going to ask Manoj to answer one question, and I'll address the others to you. Is there any test to define like products? Are like products from different nations treated equally?
Is there any test?
Is there any test to define like products?
Well, yes, that was actually, is there an easy way to go backwards, or do I have to slide?
Just the arrow keys would be best.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. Yes. Wait a minute. What was that? Yeah, the basic tests that have been developed by the appellate body are these 4 factors. What are the product properties? And well, let's take the liquor tax case, the Japanese case. Product properties, gin and, vodka and shochu are very similar. They're not, whiskey is different. It's made from a different, so the properties, the end use, well, the end use obviously is the same. It's to get drunk or just to have a nice time. Consumer taste and habits. Well, for example, if you walk into a bar and, gosh, they've just run out of whiskey, but would you take a shochu instead? Some would, some wouldn't. And then the tariff classification. And so there's the normal factors. As I said, in the asbestos case, they looked at health because of the asbestos, obviously, is a very unhealthy product to use. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. And does the discrimination towards like products under MFN have to be explicit, or is it determined to be the effect of the rule of in question?
That's, again, very good questions coming up. That is basically, you look at the facts. Now, going back to the Japanese case, unless you had to go back into the facts and understand that shochu is made in Japan, whereas the other products were imported, most of them were imported. You had to look at the factors. I hope that answers the question. Well, all right, let me give you some numbers. 75% of domestically produced alcohol was charged at the lowest rate, and 95% of imports at the highest rate. Well, that was a very strong suggestion of discrimination. So you really have to get into what are the facts, what are the shares of the market occupied by the different products.
I'm going to address the next question to Manoj, if he's able to address this. Sure. India removed MFN status to Pakistan in 2019. What are the situations revolving around this treatment?
I was expecting that you'll ask this question to me. So this question is really interesting, and to understand this, that why India did that. It's because of the drastic terrorist attack on Indian armed forces in Pulwama district. And it came strictly out of that, okay, India will levy around 200% custom duties, if I'm not wrong, 200% custom duties to all the, or to the major goods that will be coming from Pakistan, and they're basically fruits and cement, if I'm not wrong. And it's a diplomacy matter, that it's not core trade matter that Pakistan has done something against the trade practices or like something else, or India want to punish it in that sense. But it came out of sovereignty and the attack on our forces. And India is in no mood to negotiate that right now with the Pakistani government. And obviously there is no like kind of initiative that Pakistani government has taken, as far as my knowledge goes. And it same happens with the Chinese authorities when this attack recently in the northeastern state of India happened. India did put some tariffs and also ban a lot of applications, web applications. So sometimes it's not strictly trade things or trade issues, but it's sovereignty or we call like protection of our armed forces and the feeling of the nation. So this is all is happening around this most favored nation clause with Pakistan.
Okay, Patrick, I'm going to return to you real quick.
Well, oh, sorry, got another question for me.
No, please go ahead.
No, go ahead. Do you want me?
Is there any hierarchy while dealing with factors for determining application of national treatment?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but I think the answer is no. I'm not sure quite what is meant by a hierarchy. Maybe the questioner could rephrase the question.
Yeah, if I may, whoever the anonymous attendee might be, after our program, after our 2 sessions this evening, we'll have an open session if that person would like to join in and have a more detailed discussion by actually talking to Patrick. Please stay around and you can redefine your question, and that's true for everyone, by the way.
Okay.
The next question is, does GATT take into account cultural, religious considerations in determining like products?
That's a great question, and we're going to come to that later. Not in terms of like product, but there is an exception which could cover religious, which would allow you to avoid the requirements of treating something as a like product for religious reason. It comes up, there's an interesting case we'll look at later when we get the exceptions involving alcohol. Yeah, let's deal with that later on when we get to it.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Manoj real quick. In the India-Pakistan case, isn't the retaliatory measure taken by India a disproportional measure and hence a violation of GATT?
Robert, are you asking this to me?
Yes, please.
Like if we talk about the WTO measures, yes, it is, because it's against the most favored nation clause and the best practices under the WTO agreement and the multilateral setting that we have. But sometimes, and as a international trade law practitioner, I can say that sometimes countries have to do things that are against, like, I'm not encouraging it, but to suffice the, I would say, the sentiment of the nation, because armed forces, and especially in a country like India, where armed forces are given lots of respect, I'm sure, in every country. Sometimes countries have to punish the other country in this way, and I would say, like, as an Indian, I can say that Pakistani authorities have an access to the WTO system, Appellate Body Dispute Settlement Authority, and they can go and very well fight the case. So, but this is what happens when you attack a country, or you are like, I don't want to go into that debate, but yes, I acknowledge on the same like on the same hand, I acknowledge that yes, it was against the WTO measures, but these things happen happens in international trade, and this is what happening with China after the attack in the northeastern state on our armed forces.
Okay, and I'm going to do this, Patrick, for brevity. I will ask one more question. When you're ready to take a break, I'm going to address 3 other questions with you, and then when you come back from break, you can address those.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. So the last question before you finish and we'll take a break is, does end use come into play while considering what like products are?
Yes, the answer is absolutely. It's one of the. I think it's yes. It's certainly one of the factors.
Okay.
Okay, so should we take a 5-minute break or 10 minutes? So, well, here we can refill our coffee cups. Given the time in India, you probably maybe filling your wine glasses.
Let's take a 5-minute break,
Okay.
and I'll also address some questions with you. Thank you.
Manish, I'm back, so anytime it's appropriate to restart.
Sure, I think everyone is on the line.
Okay.
So we can just start in a minute.
All right, good. By the way, these are terrific questions you're asking, which is great. Okay, now, one of the things I want to emphasize is that the panels in the appellate body have given very broad readings to the national treatment requirement. For example, when a foreign investor wanted to invest in Canada, they had to get approval from the Canadian Foreign Investment Review Board. And frequently, the board would say, fine, we'll give you permission, but a condition is that you must buy a certain percentage of your material inputs from Canadian sources. And we want you to invest here, but we don't want you importing all your raw materials. We want you to buy domestic, for obvious reasons, to help the domestic economy. Now, question is, does that is there a problem there with Article 3, national treatment? And in a very important ruling, that panel, this goes back to pre-WTO days, said, yes, it is a violation of Article 3, because basically you are discriminating for whatever percentage, let's say it's 50% from Canadian sources, you must buy from Canadian sources, you are discriminating against imports. They can't compete for that percentage of the input. So that is a violation, and we'll see this comes up later, and particularly there's a case against India. And then another case Canadian authorities set this is another liquor case, alcohol case, set the same minimum prices for imported and domestic beer. And so the United States brought a case against Canada, and Canada said, well, what do you mean? How can this be discrimination? It's the same minimum price. It's $5 a bottle or whatever it is. And the panel went, again, this is a panel case, a GATT case rather than WTO. They said, no, it is a violation because you are not allowing the imported beer to compete by selling at lower prices. They should have the right to compete. So again, very broad reading. And I want to mention a few other, one before I get to other examples. There is an exception in Article 3 for government procurement. So where a government is buying private cars or computers or chairs or tables for its own use, other than resale, then that is an exception. So governments have the right to buy for their own use, and they don't have to pay attention to national treatment. They can discriminate. However, to make life more complicated, there is something called the Government Procurement Agreement, which came out of the Uruguay round, which eliminates that exception, but it only applies to countries which sign up to it, which is mostly OECD countries. We will look at that later in the week. Now, just some examples. We talked about the asbestos case. Korea beef, they've always been very protectionist about their beef, and they had a requirement that imported and domestic beef had to be sold separately, either in separate retail outlets or if it was a large department store in different parts of the store. That was held to be a violation. Now there's the Indian case, solar power. A solar power producer who wanted to enter a long-term supply agreement with the government had to use a certain amount of domestic content in building the plant. Again, a violation of Article 3 because it was cutting out imported raw materials for that percentage. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there are a couple of interesting ones. Canada, very similar requirement to the India one. Now, an interesting case against the United States, a fairly recent case in the last few years. The United States put a ban on imports of flavored cigarettes. Why? Well, because that was a way of getting young people to smoke, because tobacco, raw tobacco, is kind of harsh. But if you flavor it with something nice, then you're more likely to smoke it. But curiously enough, there was an exception for menthol cigarettes. And so the Philippines, Indonesia, which produces these clove-flavored cigarettes, which were banned under this US law, brought a case and said this is a violation of national treatment. So the key question, again, is like product. Was menthol-flavored cigarettes like other flavored cigarettes? The United States, oh, no, they're quite different. End use is mostly women who smoke menthol and so forth. But as you can probably imagine, the appellate body said, no, menthol cigarettes are like the other cigarettes, and therefore you have a violation. I'm not going to go through the other two. They're a little complicated, but I hope you get the idea. All right, so let's now move to tariffs. What is the purpose of tariffs? Well,
Patrick?
hey, yes?
I apologize, but just before we get out of like product subjects, I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and if you wanted to address the ones that I presented you during the break, that's fine. The first question, are like products, are the like product determination factors under MFN similar to or exchangeable with those under national treatment?
I'm not sure there's ever been a ruling, but the answer, I think, is absolutely yes. I'm sure it would be treated the same way, the same interpretation. Now, the one difference, and this is important to emphasize, with taxes, the Article 3 national treatment goes beyond like product. It goes to directly competitive or substitutable. So it's a little bit broader there. But in terms of the like product, I think the definition would be treated in exactly the same way. But good question.
Okay, and the last question here is the amount of discrimination import? I think that may have been miswritten. For example, in one case, there is a minimum domestic purchase requirement of 50%, but in another it's only 2%.
And so just read the first part of the question again.
Yeah. Is there an amount of discrimination for an import? For example, in one case, there's a minimum domestic purchase requirement of 50%, but in another case, there's only a requirement of 2%.
The like product requirement in Article 3, where you're dealing with taxes or other regulations, like product, you cannot have any discrimination at all. It's got to be, even a 1% difference would be technically a violation. Now, whether anybody would bring a case for a 1%, I would doubt. It's not worth it. But where you're dealing with the second leg of Article 3 on taxes, competitive, directly competitive, or substitutable, there's got to be an impact on trade, which would that's the definition is, or the way it's been interpreted, there must be some impact on trade, which would imply a considerably higher degree of discrimination, maybe 10, 15%. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
All right, so moving on to tariffs. Why do we have tariffs? Well, we think of it mostly as protection, to protect domestic industries from competition. I think Warren mentioned yesterday that Japan has an 800% tariff on rice, and that's designed to protect rice farmers in Japan. It's not a revenue-raising device because nobody's going to sell rice and pay an 800% duty. But traditionally, it was also to raise revenue. The first US law passed after the revolution was in fact customs law. And most revenue, until income tax was introduced in the United States in, I think, 1915 or around then, most revenue most government revenue came from tariffs and other types of tax, but not income tax, but mostly customs. And even some developing countries still have a very high proportion of government revenue is in the form of tariffs, up to 70% in some of the smaller, the least developed countries. I don't know what the number is in India. And one of the problems is for these governments, as tariffs come down through the various negotiating rounds, they get less revenue, and so many of them now are turning to a value-added tax. But it's important to understand tariffs are the only form of trade restriction not prohibited by the GATT. And there's no upper limit. We talked about Japan and an 800% tariff on rice. So no upper limit. You can charge any tariff you like. But, and this is the huge impact, the achievement of the GATT encourages, through these negotiating rounds, of which there have been 8 so far, starting in Geneva in 1947 and finishing with the Uruguay round, in terms of completing a round, it encourages reduction of tariffs. But it doesn't require that. It doesn't require negotiated reductions. So the idea is that one of these negotiating rounds, countries get together and they agree to reduce the tariffs by a certain amount, but they don't have to. It's entirely up to them. Now, the important point is that once a tariff has been negotiated, it is said to be bound, it's a binding, and it cannot be raised above the bound level. It can be reduced, and that becomes very important, as we'll see, I think, on the next slide. And all this is filed with the WTO, the schedules, so-called schedules of bound rates. So if you ever need to know what the bound rate is, and this can be important. And just to some numbers, 99% of developed country tariffs are bound, about 3/4 of developing country tariffs, all Latin American tariffs are bound, and all agricultural tariffs. And as I've said, the tariff bindings are scheduled. And in addition to tariffs, members can impose at the border a charge equivalent to an internal tax, as long as it is non-discriminatory. It complies with Article 3. If you have a VAT on domestic goods, you could charge that at the border on imports, or a manufacturing tax. Dumping, a kind of a duty, which we'll look at later in the week, and then fees or charges commensurate with the cost of services. I used to represent the Colombian cut flower industry, and they are bringing in literally jumbo jets full of flowers every day. Well, if they arrives on Saturday and the flowers sit in the plane or on the tarmac for a couple of days until customs is working, that's not good for the flowers. And so customs would bring people in to work overtime, but then the importers would have to pay for the overtime. So that's fairly sensible. A lot of the GATT WTO rules are really common sense. Now, this is a very important concept. There are really three types of binding. Below the existing level, this is where you negotiate and you reduce your tariff on cars, let's say from 10% to 5%. So before the negotiation, you could charge a 10% duty. Now you can't charge above 5%. And if you increase it above 5%, you are in violation. Now, the country might say, well, look, we're willing to give some assurance to people and we will bind at the existing level. 10% is the existing level, and we're not going to go below that. Our industry isn't ready for that type of competition, but we will bind at 10%, which gives you some assurance, and it gives you assurance we will never apply a rate above 10%. So it gives you a bit of assurance of access to the market. Now, very importantly, there are so-called ceiling bindings where you agree to bind your tariff, but above the existing level. So let's say, again, use our example of 10% on cars. We'll say, well, we're not ready actually to bind that rate. We want some flexibility. So we will bind at 20%, which means that if we want to, at some point, we want to give more protection to our domestic industry, we can raise the tariff as much as 20%, but never more than that. And this is extremely important, particularly for developing countries. There's often a big, big difference in the ceiling rate and the applied rate. In the case of India, I haven't got the exact numbers, but it's something like an applied rate on all products average is 50%, whereas the ceiling rate is 50%, the applied rate is 15%. So it's about 1/3. And with agriculture, even bigger, the average bound rate is about 100, whereas the applied rate is more like 40%. Now that's very important because what it means is that at any time, an industry that decides it wants protection can ask the government to raise the rate up to the ceiling rate, and they can do that. They're free to do that because they haven't bound a rate below the ceiling rate. In the example, say 20%. So that gives a lot of flexibility and potential protection. Okay, so much for tariffs. Transparency, as I've said, and is obvious to any of you, that if you are trading, if you're importing or exporting, you need to know what the laws are. If you don't know what the tariff is, or you don't know what the labor requirements are, you don't know what the safety requirements are, or the pollution requirements on a car, then it's very difficult to do business. So Article 10 says you must publish promptly, and laws, regulations, judicial decisions, etc., and really get customs clarification, anything at the border, because remember the GATT basically deals with border measures. It deals with tariffs, it deals with quotas, and so forth. Excuse me. And I realize I'm talking faster again. I apologize. I will try to slow down. And so this is the GATT itself, and the individual agreements. There are several requirements. One is to publish regulations. Now, what does publish mean? Basically, it means you put the regulations in the United States, it's the Federal Register. In Mexico, it's the Diario Oficial. I think the EU is the official journal. I don't know actually what it is in India, but it's whatever your official government journal is. So that's publish. In one case involving Chile, Chile published a decision which they were required to publish, and they put one copy in the public library in Santiago, and the WTO said, no, that's not good enough, that's not publishing. There's also a requirement under some agreements to notify other members, and this is publishing to your own people in your own official bulletin. Notifying other members is really notifying the WTO, who will then notify all the other members. and sometimes inquiry points. And the idea here is sort of one-stop shopping. So you should be able to find out all the regulations relating to the import of beef, for example, at one place instead of having to go for different agencies. So these are the different types, and I've given you some examples. Also, interestingly, the Article 10 requires that if in most WTO agreements, not all of them, the sanitary and phytosanitary and technical barriers to trade don't have this, but many do, and they require decisions by the executive, by the administration, to be subject to independent review. Sometimes they require courts. In the case of customs, the customs agreements, then courts are required. In some cases, it's arbitration. But the idea is that government officials make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes, and there should be some way of correcting it outside the agency that made that decision. And of course, in some cases, it's not a mistake. It's corruption. We talked about the Russian baby food situation yesterday. So that's really all that we need to say about transparency. Let me just get my notes out. And it was interesting, about 10 or 12 years ago, the ILI, and I was involved in this, we were, we did a project to train about 250 senior Chinese judges on WTO law, because they were going to have to understand it, because decisions, now that China had joined the WTO, decisions by the Chinese government would have to be reviewed independently. And actually, I was quite impressed by the caliber of the Chinese judges. They seem to really understand the idea of judicial review, although they're not completely independent. Anyway, that's another story. Now, the third or the last of the important core values is quantitative restrictions, often called quotas. And you can see Article 11, prohibitions or restrictions other than duties, taxes, or other charges. As we see, duties and taxes are allowed, but any other type of restriction or prohibition, whether it's quotas or licenses, are not permitted. And I've highlighted imports or exports. We normally think of quotas as applying to imports. You put a restriction on the volume or value of imports, that's not allowed. But also it applies to exports. Not as common, but it does happen. There was two very big cases, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, involving China. China had put export restrictions on exports of raw materials like bauxite, and that was held by the appellate body to be illegal. The term prohibition or restriction has been read very, very broadly. And I'm sorry, I'll come back to that. I've got a discussion on a later slide. There are exceptions. As I've said, there are always exceptions to the rules. Temporary export restrictions to relieve critical shortages of foodstuffs or other essential products. In other words, you can restrict exports in order to your own people don't have to starve. Many years ago, there was a huge outcry by Japan because the US had a very poor soybean crop one year, and we sold a lot to Japan. And so we stopped selling to Japan. It was known as the soybean shoku, and Japan was appalled, and it caused some serious trade problems. But that was an example. That was perfectly legal because there was a shortage. Classification don't come up very often. Now, interestingly, import restrictions on agricultural fisheries products necessary to enforcement of certain government measures. Agriculture, as we said, is a difficult subject because farmers are much more subject to market forces and to climate issues or disease. And so there's a lot of support given to them, and also import restrictions. And the idea, to give you an example, on milk, the government, US government, would give a guarantee that it would buy surplus milk at a certain price, let's say $2 a gallon. This meant anybody, any farmer who couldn't sell all their milk, the government would take it for $2 a gallon. Well, this obviously would set a minimum price in the United States of $2. No one's going to sell their price on the market for less than $2 if they can get the government to buy it for $2. Well, now, supposing you're a farmer in Windsor, Ontario, on the Canadian side of the border, and the market price in Canada is only $1.50, what are you going to do with your milk? You're going to sell a lot of it to the United States. So what this is saying, this was in the in the original Article 11, that you could restrict imports of milk from Canada to preserve or to protect the market. But that is now outlawed by the agriculture agreement. So although you see this in Article 11, if you look at the GATT, that exception is still there, but it's been prohibited by the agriculture agreement, by the Uruguay Round Agriculture Agreement. Okay, why do we not like quotas? Well, it seals off domestic markets. If you've got a tariff, unless it's 800%, you may be able to sell over the tariff because there's no absolute limit on how much you can sell. It's harder to determine discrimination. It's less transparent. Quotas are usually operated by government officials, whereas tariffs are usually passed by the legislature. It also doesn't produce revenue to the government. Tariffs do, but quotas don't, unless they're sold. Some countries sell quotas in the rare occasion that they're used. Article 11, and I'm sorry, something I should have added before. Although quotas as such are prohibited, we also have something called tariff rate quotas. That is a two-level tariff. A certain quantity is allowed in at a low tariff rate, for example, 5%. But after that quantity has come in, let's say it's 100,000 or 10,000 tons, then the tariff goes up to a much higher rate. So it, in a sense, acts like a quota, but it's not a quota because you can sell at the higher tariff rate if you can do that economically. And so that is permitted, and you see that quite often in agriculture. So this just describes how you should allocate. You try to figure out, well, without a quota, you would have had an X percent of the market, so we'll give you X percent of the quota. Now, a couple of interesting questions. Again, I want to emphasize, oops, I'm sorry, I've gone too far. Okay, here are a couple of interesting questions. The United States brought a case against Japan on semiconductors, and the case settled. And part of the settlement was that the Japanese government advised the semiconductor producers not to export below cost. Advised. What does that mean? Well, Europe, which was benefiting from these very cheap semiconductor imports from Japan, the below cost imports, they brought a case against Japan saying that this was a violation, this was a ban on exports and therefore fell under, excuse me, Article 11. Japan said, what do you mean? This is just advice. We're not telling them they can't export below cost. We're just saying it would be a good idea. Well, what do you think? Well, the panel, this is an early case under a GATT panel, said, come on, we know Japan. We know what happens in Japan. When the government advises a company to do something, we know that means they must do it, and they'll probably be penalized if they don't. So that, again, very broad reading, they said that was covered by Article 11, even though it wasn't in the form of a law or a legally binding regulation. Another interesting example, Canada required foreign manufacturers under the review board to export a certain percentage of their production. Now, is that a violation of Article 11? It's certainly interfering with trade. It's putting a certain requirement on. But again, one very important thing, which I haven't mentioned before, but let me mention it now and probably again, you always have to look at the exact words of the agreements, in this case, the GATT, because sometimes the answers are not what you would think intuitively. Sometimes they're counterintuitive. And my reaction to this, without looking at the language, would be, well, oh, you're interfering with trade. And surely the whole idea of the GATT is to get governments out of interfering with trade. And this is by requiring them to export, let's say 50%, and obviously the reason is to earn foreign revenue, then that must be a violation. But no, let's go back and look at the language. Prohibitions or restrictions other than duties, taxes, or charges. Well, is a requirement to export a certain percentage, a minimum amount, is that a prohibition or restriction? The answer is no, it's the opposite. It's actually a requirement. And so in the Canadian Review Board case, the panel said, no, that is not a violation of Article 11. So again, always look at the language. Freedom of transit, we've covered the four major core grounds. So I want to now talk about a few other ones and then look at the exceptions. And we should just about have time. Freedom of transit. Landlocked countries have a huge disadvantage. Uganda, I've done some work there, and apparently the cost of importing through Kenya or Tanzania, of importing or exporting, as 20% of the cost. They're under a significant disadvantage anyway. Now, what happens if Uganda gets into a political dispute with Kenya, and Kenya says, right, we're not going to let these products through, we're going to block it, or we're going to charge you quite a high tariff for the right to bring the goods through our country into your country. And so Article 5 says you must allow freedom of transit and then impose reasonable charges. So very important. Balance of payments. Basically, remember the whole problems in the 1930s came about because of balance of payments problems and restrictions on imports and exports and subsidies. And so this is basically saying a country that runs a balance of payments can impose import restrictions, a reasonable level, preferably price-based measures, in other words, tariffs across the board rather than quotas, because tariffs are preferred. And you can see the language, we don't need to go into it in detail, but and then there's a separate provision for Article 18 for developing countries. And there's not a great difference, but it's a little bit more flexible. You're allowed a little more latitude. Now, I have a very interesting case, again, an early case against India. India had imposed something like 2,000, sorry, I've got a slide, 2,000 quotas on 2,000 imported products, and they said it's a balance of payments problem. Well, when the GATT panel looked into this, and then the appellate body, they discovered that India at that time had about $16 billion of foreign reserves, foreign currency reserves, and it was actually going up. I think it had gone up 2 billion from the previous year. The IMF, in cases like this, the IMF is brought in to give its opinion and said, no, really, India is not under serious balance of payments problems. So I'm afraid India lost that case. I will say, and we'll come in as you said, India has brought some very important and won some very important cases in the appellate body. It's been quite very active. Okay, now let's talk briefly about exceptions. There are a series of exceptions which basically says in order for these, in these situations, you don't have to follow the rules, you can bypass them. And I've highlighted the important ones, public morals. So in other words, to protect public morals, you can, and examples where the appellate body has recognized that the public moral exception applies: gambling. There's a very interesting case we'll talk about when we get to services, because this case, in fact, involves services, but it basically the same exceptions apply in the General Agreement on Trade. So alcohol. A country might ban the import or sale of alcohol. Well, if that's, it might be a Muslim country, most like it would be, that would almost certainly be justified under public morals. Another interesting one, Europe banned the import of seal products. People didn't like the pictures of baby seals being clubbed by Canadians. And that, again, was held to be within the public morals thing. So that has come in a few cases. The most important exceptions are B, which is protection of human, animal, or plant life or health, and G, which is conservation of exhaustible natural resources. Now, somebody asked the question yesterday whether environment is ever an issue, and the fact is this is an environmental exception. And there have been some cases, fresh air, for example, was held to be an exhaustible natural resource. Again, showing a very broad, I think when it was drafted, this provision really was designed to protect things like minerals and oil, so on, but it's greatly broadened, say, fresh air. Measures designed to cut down on automobile pollution were held to be within this particular exception. And endangered species. There's a very important case, actually one brought by India, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, which involved shrimp, the catching of shrimp and protecting turtles, which are endangered species.
Hey, Patrick, would you have time for 2 quick questions?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So the first question is, how effective or timely have countries been in complying with the orders of appellate authorities?
A very good question, and the answer is it depends. It's a good legal answer, right? On the one hand, on the other hand, it depends. China, interestingly enough, has been, at least until recently, and I'm not sure about the recent, has been pretty good about. The United States has been all over the place. There was a big anti-dumping case, which we'll discuss when we get there, and the U.S. Congress, we were found in violation. The U.S. Congress said, hell no, we're not going to comply with this. I think 70 senators signed a letter saying we're not going to comply, we will not agree to changes in our law. But eventually, and as we'll see when we get to dispute settlement, there is something called retaliation. The various countries which had won the case started imposing high tariffs, which they're entitled to do under the dispute settlement process, and the US came. But it took years, and so it can take a very long time, but it can happen very quickly, or the countries can settle the case. That is the preferred solution, is to settle the case, and that happens quite often.
Okay, and the second question is, what is the reason for this wide or loose standard of interpretation in trade law compared to civil law or criminal law? Is the power...
Could you say that again?
Sure. What is the reason for the wide standard of interpretation in trade law as compared to civil law or criminal law? Is the power of interpretation given to the panel always used in the best interest of trade, or has it sometimes been misused? And I think the example is when the panelist is interpreting Japanese advise, like the Japanese advise their companies to do something or other.
These are wonderful questions. And I would say that, remember what the organization is called. It's called the World Trade Organization. It's designed to promote trade. That's the whole idea, is to lower barriers to trade, get more people trading, because all the economists tell us that trade is good. We've talked about that yesterday. It produces all kinds of advantages. We don't need to repeat those. And I would say that the appellate body sort of regards trade as important and gives broad interpretations to the various restrictions that you can't put on trade. So I think it's very pro-trade, and I would argue that that's one of the reasons that they have interpreted these agreements very broadly.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And we'll save our questions until you're done with this session.
Okay, good. So, a very important ruling in an early case, Thai cigarettes. Thailand, this was a GATT panel case. Thailand put a restriction on imports of cigarettes. Now, why did they do this? What was the reason? They said, well, we all know that cigarettes are bad for you. I'm not sure that they'd been discovered, of course. We know cigarettes are bad. So we're really trying to protect our population from the harmful effect of cigarettes. Perhaps it won't surprise you to know that there was a healthy Thai cigarette industry producing cigarettes there. So what was the real reason that Thailand was it really to protect its people from cigarettes, or was it actually to protect its own cigarette industry? You can make your own judgment on that, but I know what I think. And the panel issued a very important ruling. It said, if you're going to rely on this health exception, necessary to protect human, animal, plant life, or health, you've got to show it doesn't apply. You can't rely on it if something less trade restrictive would have achieved the same result. So what would have achieved the same result? What would have cut down on cigarette consumption that didn't involve a trade violation? Well, think about that. They could have increased the taxes on all cigarettes, domestic or import. They could have restricted the outlets. Japan did that, in fact, on imported cigarettes, and that was a violation. They would only allow imported cigarettes to be sold through a very few number of outlets. So there are a number of things they could have done. Advertise or ban advertising, which I think is true in many countries now. You can't advertise cigarettes. So there are lots of things that they could have done, which would have had the same result, cutting back on cigarette consumption, but without restricting trade more than restricting imports. I'm going to jump ahead. The Columbia Textiles case talked about necessity factors. They're fairly obvious, I think. We don't need to go into that. Now, China, I mentioned before that China had imposed export restrictions on raw materials. Now, again, why? Well, they said, oh, it's preserve exhaustible natural resources, which is one of the exceptions, Article 20G. Well, think about it. If you want to preserve exhaustible natural resources, do you just restrict exports or do you restrict production? So that exception was thrown out. And then they said, well, let's also protect health because mining of bauxite causes pollution and that causes health problems. Well, again, if you think about it, if you're going to restrict pollution, why wouldn't you restrict all production but not just restrict exports? And the real reason, of course, was by restricting exports, bauxite was one example. They're lowering the price of bauxite in China, and this is going to benefit the aluminum producers and give them lower costs. So again, those restrictions didn't apply. Now, this is an important, and comes up in a couple of cases. If you're relying on one of these exceptions, there's what's called a chapeau, which is French for hat, and it basically means the introduction. It says you can't use the exceptions in a way that would produce arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail. So that's a very important restriction on use of the exceptions. And there are a couple of interesting cases. The US passed, the US Environmental Protection Agency passed regulations designed to cut down on pollution from cars, automobile pollution. And the appellate body said, yes, fresh air is an exhaustible natural resource. We agree with that. That's a very broad ruling. And the measure related to its conservation by cutting down on pollution, but it was designed in a way that favored domestic producers of gasoline and discriminated against importers. And so that was held to be arbitrary and unjustifiable. There's no justification for it. Now, a very interesting case was the shrimp case, the shrimp turtle case. I don't know if any of you remember the so-called Battle of Seattle, the 1999 WTO ministerial meeting in Seattle, which was a bit of a disaster, lots of demonstrators. And I should, to make full disclosure, one of my daughters was demonstrating with my granddaughter, but she said she didn't break windows. It was a peaceful protest. But that was and the reason I bring it up is a lot of the demonstrators were dressed as turtles because the panel had just ruled on the US shrimp case. Now, here's the issue. Catching shrimp with nets caught by boats, a lot of turtles drown. They get caught in the nets and they drown. And they are many of them are endangered species. So the US banned importation of shrimp caught by boats which didn't have turtle exclusion devices, which allowed, I think, 99% of the turtles to escape. But of course, it also allowed a lot of shrimp to escape, so it was expensive. We applied that to our own shrimp boats, but then we said, you can't import in the United States unless you have a turtle exclusion device. Now, what was curious was the way it was applied. A number of countries in the Caribbean, I think in Latin America, they were given 3 years to comply and to come into compliance. And they were given technical assistance. I think they were given money. They were certainly given advice on how to do this. Other countries, including India, Malaysia, 2 other countries, possibly Indonesia, were only given 4 months and they weren't given any help. So again, India and these other countries brought a case to the WTO and they said, this is a violation because you are discriminating and you cannot apply these exclusions in an arbitrary and justifiable discrimination. There's no justification for what you're doing. And so again, that case was, India won that case. India and the other countries won that case. So, and you might ask, why did the US behave in this way? Well, actually, they were ordered by the court. Some environmentalists went to court, organizations went to court and say, you should be applying this requirement to all countries. And so the court basically says you've got to apply it to countries like India, and you only have 4 months to do it. Now, interestingly, at the WTO, the US said, well, you can't hold us, our courts are independent. You can't hold us responsible for what the courts do. It's nothing to do with us. And as you can probably imagine, the WTO did not give that argument, the appellate body, much credence. They said, look, internationally, you're responsible for what your courts do, even if you can't control them. Now, very quickly, another important exception.
Patrick, can I ask you something?
Yeah, please.
So you talked about the environment and endangered species and all, and you know that I work in the area of environmental protection on different levels. So I'm curious to understand, like, obviously there is an objective of sustainable development and environmental protection in the agreement establishing the WTO. But is it enough, like, just to have this in the preamble of the agreement and not have a specific agreement for the countries like to protect environment? So one, like, why a WTO should not have in-house expertise on the trade issues related to the environment and impacting environment? And I think there is a trade and environment committee in-house with WTO, but I'm not sure how robust that is. So that's my first question or concern. Second is, like, when you talked about endangered species, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, which is known as CITES, which is an international agreement between governments. How WTO cooperate with CITES, or like take knowledge from CITES to deal with the issues related to trade affecting the environment or the climate? Or does WTO, or WTO is interested to consult multilateral organization or intergovernmental bodies like UNEP, which is United Nations Environment Program, or UNFCCC, or when it comes to scientific issues, maybe IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? So is WTO really looking to the issue of climate change or the sustainable development or environment protection very seriously? Because it doesn't look to me that they are. So I want to have your views on that. And I think that's very important and a new concern in the trade community. So, yeah.
That's a great question. I think I can answer the first question quite easily. And I'm sure many people who are attending this conference know much more about international law than I do. But I would say anything in the preamble to an international agreement is not binding. Now, it may help to interpret provisions, but that would be my view. But Manoj, you probably have a more understanding of this, but that would be my view. Gosh, you've raised some very big and important questions. I am not, I would say it's above my pay grade, in that I'm not an expert on the environment and trade. Certainly something like CITES, where we have bans on trade in ivory, for example. I mean, that would be, if you think about it, that would be a violation of Article 11, the ban on quotas, because a ban is a quota, a zero quota, if you like, but it's exactly, violates Article 11. But I think that would undoubtedly be protected by the public morals exception in the, well, as the import of seal products was banned by Europe, and and that was held. Now, for reasons I didn't get into, they actually lost the case, but that was for technical reasons. But the appellate body clearly held that that the restriction would fall within the public morals exception. They failed because they applied it in a discriminatory way, and so it failed under the chapeau. But so I think, I mean, that's yeah, it's a very good question, and what I can do is, we've got a lot of experts coming right at the end, the very last session. Two of the top experts in the world, Gary Horlick, who is always rated as one of the two best trade lawyers in the world, and Wendy Cutler, who was at USTR for many years and was one of the negotiators of TPP. I would suggest that we ask them that question. I think they will know much more than I can answer. I apologize for that.
No, that was a great comment, Patrick, like the way you tried to explain it. But I'm also looking forward to the session of Arthur and Anuradha from India.
Yes.
They both are speaking on trade and environment, and their practice very much focuses on trade and environment, and especially like the experience Arthur has, and also Anuradha from the Indian perspective. And obviously Gary and Wendy are like having the overall view of the trade and how the WTO should look like in the near future. So let's see what they have to say. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, now just very quickly, the last couple of slides, national security. Article 21 of the GATT says the member may take action it considers necessary for the protection of essential security interests. And the important fissionable materials, we can ban the export of atom or hydrogen bombs, which is good. Traffic in arms is carefully controlled. We have regulations here, and most countries do. But most importantly, in time of war or other emergency in international relations, what does that mean? Well, during 1996, we passed a law, the United States passed a law which was basically designed against Cuba. I won't get into all the details of it, but it affected various European and Canadian companies which were doing business in Cuba. And they brought a case in the WTO saying this is a violation of, I think it was Article 11, there was a ban on sales. And the US said, we're not going to show up. You have the WTO, the appellate body has no jurisdiction over our use of national security. Why? Because you see the language, members may take action it considers necessary. It considers necessary, not that the WTO considers necessary or agrees. So we are free to do anything we want in the name of national security. The Swedish government once tried to justify a ban on the import of shoes on the ground. They needed to protect their shoe industry because armies needed boots to march on. That got laughed out of court, basically. The Helms-Burton case was much more serious. The US said, we're not going to show up. We're not going to take any notice of what you're doing. That's settled. Europe realized, because if the US won that case, if the WTO agreed that they could do anything they wanted, then you just opened up a huge Pandora's box. Anybody can do anything. The example I use is we might put an import on imports of bubble gum because the US might argue that soldiers really need bubble gum to be effective fighters. On the other hand, if the WTO ruled against the United States, there's a real danger the United States might pull out of the WTO. They say, how dare you people, you so-called experts in Geneva, how do you know what our national security interests are? So it's a very tough tension. The Helms-Burton case went away, but more recently, as you know, the Trump administration imposed restrictions based on national security on steel and aluminum. There's not time to get into the merits of it, but there's certainly rather questionable whether it's justified, but they have imposed quite high tariffs. That has been challenged by the various countries affected by it. There's also a possible case on autos and parts and others. Now, interestingly, there are two other cases in which this issue has come up. Ukraine, Russia. Ukraine brought a case against Russia. Russia was restricting exports to Ukraine, and the panel said they didn't look at this issue of it considers necessary, but they said what we can look at is this a time of war or other emergency in international relations? Now, in that case, they said we can consider it. In fact, we do find it is a time of war or emergency because Russia has basically invaded Ukraine. But the point is, they said that issue is justiciable. It can be reviewed. And the case for the restrictions on steel and aluminum in terms of war or other emergency, much harder to justify. And I think my personal view is there's a good case that if the dispute settlement system ever revives under the new administration, that those cases might be thrown out, and that's going to cause a lot of dislike in Congress of the WTO. So it's a very, very serious issue. I mean, for years after Helms-Burton, you know, people have described this as a time bomb. It's ticking, and now it's ticking faster, and it's closer to resolution. Oh, one other very minor point. A member can take action in compliance with UN obligations, where the US imposes sanctions or decides to impose sanctions. Again, sanctions, bans on trade would violate Article 11, but this says if it's a UN obligation, then that's fine, you can do that. 10:31, I've gone 1 minute over. So if you don't have a congression with the content, but at least on my timing. And
okay,
now we're ready for questions.
I'm going to ask just a few more questions, and for those who wish to stay, we will also open up the opportunity to open up everyone's microphones for those who wish to talk or mutually discuss. So a couple of questions. What if promotion of trade is in opposition to justice, or opposition of justice?
Sorry, opposition of what?
Justice.
Sorry, read the question again.
So specifically it says, what if promotion of trade is in contravention of justice?
I'm not sure what type of intervention. I mean, just to give a very narrow answer, there are rules in the WTO, in the countervailing duty agreement, or subsidies and countervailing duties, against giving subsidies under certain situations. Export subsidies are basically bad, B-A-D, normally a violation. Domestic subsidies can be a violation if they cause harm. But I'm not sure quite, I think the question has a broader meaning, but I'm not quite sure what that is. I mean, how would...
Patrick, if you allow me to answer that, because there is a second question which is somehow related to that, the principles of justice and human rights. So there is a question which says, sorry, Robert, I'm
Sure,
interrupting you. So there is a question, can trade measures be challenged on human rights grounds, say before a regional court such as the European Courts of Human Rights? And the previous question was also related to that, like the concept of justice, and I would also include the concept of right to development. So many times, like human rights bodies, human rights activists has raised concern that, and in many cases actually, I'll list down the cases also, so that that human rights bodies are saying that it has taken the cognizance of potential issues that can be created by WTO-related obligations, which will negatively affect human rights. I mean, for example, the UN rapporteur I'm forgetting that, but I've read it somewhere. The UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food has expressed concerns about agreements with respect to agriculture and services affecting the right of food of vulnerable populations in less developed countries. And there are concerns again by the human rights activists being raised that
well, again, it's a very broad question. I mean, one example I can think of is I think the United States put a ban at one point on imports of footballs from Pakistan. The reason was that child labor was being used to, it was sort of suggested, I don't know whether it actually happened, but let's take that as an example. Let's suppose the US says, right, or Europe, let's take Europe. Why would we always talk about the United States? Europe says, this is terrible. 8-year-old girls in Pakistan are being forced to make footballs. This is child labor, and we're going to ban the import of this. No, it's a ban, it's a quota. Is there an exception which might apply there? And I'm asking that question to see if anybody would like to come up with the answer.
and I believe that while
clearly, I think that would, you could defend that. Europe could defend that ban by saying, look, this is public morals. Nobody believes in child labor. It's a bad thing. So that's one way I think that would, human rights. Now, I could do a plug for a book that I and Arthur Appleton, who you'll be hearing from later in the week, We edited a book, a big book on the WTO, and we included a chapter on trade and human rights. We also had one on gender and trade, and a whole range. Now, you can get it from Amazon. I think it's slightly less than $1,000. If anybody wants to buy it, I'm joking, of course, but it is 3,000 pages. It's a big book, weighs a lot of that. But yeah, I mean, these are very difficult questions, and I don't feel capable of answering them very well. But you know, keep in mind human rights, public morals. There's certainly an overlap there, and I think countries will be justified in taking actions that might violate the the basic principles of the GATT, like the quotas or bans, through one of the exceptions, and particularly human rights. I think public morals would be the obvious exception. I don't know of any cases that have dealt with human rights as such, but that's the best I can do.
If I could interject, you know, we have many speakers during this program. So if a question needs to be readdressed at some other point with another speaker, please go ahead and do so. Patrick, I'm going to ask a few more questions. Okay. Does Article 11 enable countries to enable export controls?
To impose export controls. Well, there are exceptions, as we mentioned in Article 11. Let me just go back. Yeah, temporary export restrictions. This is the one that is used probably more often than others, where you've got a shortage of foodstuffs or essential products. You used to be able to do it where you had government measures supporting agriculture, but that's no longer allowed. And again, you've got the exceptions that we talked about just now. Does that answer the question?
I'm going to say yes.
Okay. Well, does the questioner think it answered the question?
I don't know. That's another issue.
Speak up.
What does the country using public morals as a reason for a ban, like the football case, need to prove it factually in terms of data and statistics?
Yes, I think the answer is yes. I mean, yeah, without facts, just talking about it in theory, no, I think you'd have to demonstrate proof that these young girls were in fact working on footballs, maybe the number, the percentage, and so on. Yes, the answer is absolutely. You can't just walk in. I mean, that would really be like an advisory opinion, and they're not supposed to do that. One of the gripes that the US has had with the appellate body is that it does tend to issue advisory opinions, which is a no-no, and I assume it's probably a no-no in India. Certainly in the UK, courts are not supposed to give advisory opinions.
Do principles such as monetary gold principle in public international law apply to WTO disputes? Monetary gold is the principle that a decision of a dispute between two parties cannot be taken when legal interests of a third state take center stage.
Golly, that's complicated. Have you got that? Can we have that in writing? I think
I can print it out and we can.
Yeah, I think I need to look at that. That's a complicated one.
Is India's, and this might go to Manoj, is India's case of removing the MFN status on Pakistan falling under national security exemption or exception?
I would say yes, based on my experience and not much of knowledge in that field of national security exception, but I would say yes. A country can do that, and it's especially it's specifically kind of banned on Pakistani products. Like no one is going to sell products on 200% custom duties, so it's just to punish them on national security exception.
And can trade measures be challenged on human rights grounds, say before a regional court such as the European Court of Human Rights?
Sorry, could you just read that one more time?
Can trade measures be challenged on human rights grounds? And as an example, could a case come before a regional court such as the European Court of Human Rights?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. And one of the nice things about going early is I can say, as you said, there are lots of experts coming along, and I'll punt that one down the field.
Yeah, I would suggest that maybe those questions be re-asked again with other speakers.
So make a list of them, Bob, and then we can present them to the speakers too.
Right, we are archiving all of the questions, so we have it. There is a question. I'm not sure what this question means or how to interpret it. I'm going to ask it because I don't know exactly what it refers to. Can you explain water?
Water, yes. That's a great question. Let me see if I can explain it clearly. We've talked about the fact that we have bound tariff rates and we have applied rates. And particularly in the case of developing countries like India, there's often a big difference. I'm trying to remember the numbers I used. I think I said that the Indian applied rate average is about 50%. I'm sorry, the bound rate is 50%. The applied rate is about 13 or 14%. Something. It's about 1/3 of the bound rate. Now the difference between the two is known as water. That is the technical term. So in this case, the water is whatever the difference between 50 and 13 or whatever it is. Now, one of the problems, and it's a great question, I didn't get into this, but one of the problems in the Doha round was that there was basically a formula adopted for tariff cuts. Each country agreed to, or every country would reduce its tariff by X%. There would be exceptions, which you could negotiate, and developing countries were not expected to make such large cuts. The problem is the cuts were from the bound rates. So let's say India, let's take a product in which the bound rate is 50%. And the agreement is to, let's say, cut tariffs by 50%. So India says, right, we will, under this rule, we will cut our tariff to 25%. Well, yeah, but that doesn't have any practical impact because the rate that India is actually applying is 13%. All right, so now you've got a bound rate of 25%, but no change in the applied rate. And that was one of the problems at Doha. They were cutting it from the bound rate. But that's the concept of water. It's a difference between what you have agreed to do internationally, what you have bound, and the actual rate that you're applying. And again, just to emphasize, you are free without any penalty to raise your rate above the applied rate as long as you don't go above the bound rate. Does that clarify? Does that answer the question?
I'm going to presume it did, but we will have an open session, so maybe that person can jump back in and confirm the value of the answer. Last question, and then we'll open it up to a open discussion. The question is, can you just briefly describe the difference between a duty and a tariff?
Yes, I can very briefly, one word, none.
Okay.
That's very, very easy.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So I think what we'll do, Manoj, if you can help and assist in this, Patrick, we're going to ask you to, we'll take a short break of 5 minutes. Anyone who wishes to stay, we'll open up your microphones and then we can have a discussion. And for those who had questions and would like to either re-ask them or clarify them or confirm the answer, we'll be happy to take some time.
Otherwise, it will be too hasty to manage that. The people who want to stay. Robert, you want to say anything?
No. However you want to manage it. I think there's also a ability to raise your hand.
Exactly. So you can raise your hand on the Zoom platform, or you can just type your name in the chat, and we can call out that name, and then you can give your comments and anything like you want to discuss.
Just to be clear, yeah, I think you have to hit the participant list to get into the raise hand.
Yes. You can go to the more option. There is like 3 dots, and you can click and you can raise hand. I can see that Sarah has posted. Could we begin with the question? Sarah, you want to go ahead? You want to ask your question?
Hi, good evening. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes,
Sure.
yes, sir.
Good
Please.
evening. So I'm Sara D'Souza, and I was just looking at the portion on binding of tariffs. I had a question. What is the purpose of binding a tariff below the existing level? As in, I can understand at an existing level and above, but uh, what is the economic benefit of binding below an existing level?
Well, the overall benefits that every economist tells us happen with more trade. And we looked at that a bit yesterday, that you get more competition, you get lower prices, which is good for consumers. And politically, it may be helpful. Some economists, they did a study and they worked out that where a country has a free trade agreement, the chances are 19% less that they'll ever go to war. I mean, rather I hope there are not too many economists here, but I think that's rather over the top. But basically, the advantages of trade, and I mean, again, if you remember, I showed you a slide yesterday to show how trade had increased since about 1950, I think, really the start of the GATT. Enormous increase in trade, and that's because tariffs have come down. When you have high tariffs, and again, just to give you another example, between 1930 and over the next few years, because of all the restrictions on trade, the increased tariffs, the quotas, the subsidies, world trade dropped from about, I think it was about 4 billion to about 1.5 billion. It went down to about a third. And that's just completely inconsistent with the advantage of trade. I mean, look how India has benefited from lowering its tariffs and removing its quotas. I mean, it's huge growth. It's obviously caused hardship for farmers, but it's been incredibly successful. Vietnam, Chile. So I think that, in the overall economy is going to benefit from more trade. And I think that there are not many people who would disagree with that, I think. Does that help, Sarah?
Yes, yes, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Utkarsh, your hand were raised, so you want to ask anything? Okay. Pooja, would you like to ask anything? Okay. Now we have Shweta. Shweta, do you want to ask a question? You can unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Still muted.
Atharv, you have a question. You can mute yourself and you can ask your question. Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah. So, sir, I had a question. When we were talking about the factors for like products, what I wanted to know was, is there any hierarchy? In other words, what I meant was, is there any preference given to um, all those factors that we have looked at? Is there like the first factor we look at is the end use, the second factor that we look at is the way it is made? So is there any hierarchy in that sense when we are determining whether two products are like to each other?
Yeah. Well, good question. I don't think so. I mean, I'm not aware of any decision where they've talked about, particular factors being more important. On a case-by-case basis, one factor might be more important, but if there's not a sort of a set hierarchy that we first look at end use, we then look at tariffs. As far as I know, I'm not aware of anything like that.
Sir, and I also have a follow-up question to that. Why is the factor of end user important? Because a product, as you pointed out, when we were talking about the alcohol, you said that maybe a person who drinks whiskey may continue to drink whiskey, or a person who drinks vodka may not, drink vodka, but they might as well, because if a person is just looking to get drunk, they might drink anything that gets them drunk. So why is that a factor? Because end user may treat a product in his or her own particular way. So why is that an important factor?
Yeah, I don't know why it's important, but let me. Well, I think I mentioned this already, but what about a beef cow and a dairy cow? They have a different end use. So does that mean they're not like products? again, I don't know. They look the same, and in many, they're very similar. There's probably the same tariff, but is the end use, is that critical? And it really is. I can only say that based on my knowledge of the cases, it is very much case by case, and sometimes end use may be really important. I'm trying to think of a good example of that, and certainly I think in the liquor cases, I think the end use, I don't think you could say that shochu has a different end use than vodka, for example, or whiskey, the end use. And yeah, so that's the best I can do. I'm sorry, probably not a very good answer, but
I get
good question.
I got my answer, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay, good.
Anyone else who wants to ask a question or make a remark or discuss anything? Sarah, again, like your hand is raised, so if you want to ask, please unmute
Yes.
yourself.
Yes, hi. So for determining a directly competitive product or a substitutable product, are the same factors considered, as in end use and the other factors that we discussed?
Okay, basically, you would look to see really is the competition between the products. And again, going back to the liquor case, which is really the the sort of the granddaddy of these cases, the one that really set out the rules carefully. Sorry, I've lost the question. I apologize. Can you just ask it again, Sarah?
Yes, sir.
Oh,
My question.
No,
Oh, okay.
So you really look at the market and to determine whether there really is competition. And one way you might do that, and I think it's been done, is consumer surveys. You would ask people, well, do you regard this as competitive or substitutable? Again, an example, you walk into a bar and you ask for a vodka and they say, well, we haven't got vodka, but hey, this shochu is pretty like vodka. Maybe you'd like that instead. And maybe you say, no, I'm going to another bar. I really want my vodka. And as I think I also mentioned in that case, the shochu case, there was actually very strong evidence of competition or substitutability because the tax rates had changed from time to time, and sometimes the shochu rate went up a bit in relation to the tax on the imported goods. Sometimes it went down. Each time there was a shift in consumption. When the tax rate went up on shochu compared with the imported products, more people drank the imported products, and vice versa. So that was pretty strong evidence. Does that answer the question, Sarah?
Yes, sir. It does. Thank you. I had one more question. I'd asked this earlier in the Q&A. Just to simplify it, my question was about the monetary goal principle, which is that whether principles such as monetary goal, which is a public international law principle, applies in WTO disputes, which is basically to say that if there is a dispute in trade between two countries and this entire dispute is subject to the legal interests of a third state. So suppose there is, I don't know, a multilateral trade agreement, and here there is a dispute between two states, but the rights of the third state will directly be affected by the dispute between these two states. Is there any kind of requirement that the third state also be considered while deciding this dispute, or how would that proceed?
Well, that's again, Sarah, that's a great question, and we will come to some more detail next week when we talk about dispute settlement. There are two ways that countries can intervene in a case. Let's take the national security restrictions on the U.S. Tariffs on steel and aluminum. I think about 8 countries have filed cases against the United States, and they've actually filed a complaint. And these are separate cases. They have separate numbers, but they will almost certainly be consolidated when it comes to the panel and the appellate body, if that ever comes back into action. So you've got 8 countries, and they have all the rights. I mean, each one is, one may have filed first, but they're all parties to the case. But countries can also appear as third parties, in which case they can They can file briefs, they can appear at the hearings and so on to express their views. Now, they won't benefit from any sanctions that are applied. Only the countries that actually have filed a complaint will get the advantage if they win the case of being able to apply sanctions. But the third party, as I said, the third parties have the right to participate in the case, to present their views. This is interesting. For example, every anti-dumping case, as we'll see when we get to trade remedies, the vast majority of cases involving anti-dumping have been cases against the United States. But there are a lot of other cases between different countries. I mean, India has been involved in quite a few against other countries. Now, the United States files a third-party brief in just about every anti-dumping case, whether or not it directly, even if it doesn't directly involve the United States. Why? Because the United States is terrified that in another case, not involving the United States, the panel or the appellate body will issue a ruling which affects the United States' ability to do what it wants to do. And so that's the way that other countries get involved. And again, I hope that answers your question.
That does, that clarifies it, so thank you.
Good.
I saw Chetan's hand was raised. So Chetan, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Just wanted to more than a question, just a remark. So it's very interesting to see how the issue of, amongst participants and amongst, I'm sure amongst the rest of us also, how the issue of discrimination and how the issue of rights, which Sarah just pointed out, where the third party countries would also have rights, also draw a lot of attention, draws a lot of questions amongst, each one of us, the issue of discrimination in international trade law. This is one thing that I wanted to say. Secondly, what I wanted to say is it's very great to the content that is being delivered, and the amount of knowledge that is being delivered is amazing. So I wanted you to just congratulate on that, because in India we international trade law is something that is put in the curriculum as electives, and it's not a compulsory part of the course. So this platform and the things that are happening here, so that's really commendable. So thanks for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Chetan. Thanks for your remarks and comments about the discrimination thing. Like talking discrimination in general, like the entire election, and Patrick would agree with me on this. The entire election of the possible new DG of the World Trade Organization was fought on that, because the campaigns of different representatives, candidates for the WTO DG, was campaigning that we'll be working for the least developed countries or the developing countries. Even some candidates of some developed countries were also promoting that. So yes, if we talk about like in general, I'm not talking about the trade practices, but in general, because somehow, with all due respect to our developed country partners, somehow developing countries and least developed countries face the issue. And if Patrick has to say something on that.
I don't think I really have anything to add, Manish, to what you said.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, Patrick, I didn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Could you just summarize that again, Manish? Sorry, I was, yeah.
It's about like discrimination in international trade and how the WTO is not able to deal with those issues. I was talking about the recent elections of the possible WTO DG, and it was revolving around the discrimination, the campaigns of different candidates on that. So I said, like, if you have any comments on that.
Well, do you mean discrimination in terms of the individuals, or?
No, not individuals, but international trade. Like sometimes countries feel like India or other developing countries, they say that they're not being fairly treated in the WTO realm. So that's what I meant. Like that's from my experience.
Well, obviously, and I mean, Doha really collapsed because of the difference between the developed and the developing countries, which is very unfortunate. But the developing countries, really up until the Uruguay round, developing countries played very little part in the development of WTO rules. It was developed countries went along. But the developing countries, which now I think represent 75 or 80% of the total membership have realized that they have a lot of power. They're not willing to give way to the particularly US and Europe. And so I think and that's why I don't think there'll ever be another big multinational agreement like the Uruguay round. I think it's going to be just, particular countries, particularly developed countries, developing rules in areas like services, environmental goods. And I think it's very unfortunate. And I didn't get into this, and I don't want to spend much time on it, but there was definitely a feeling that the developing countries really, frankly, got cheated in the Uruguay round. There were two areas on textiles that was supposed to benefit the developing countries, but the relaxation of the rules was left very, very late. And on agriculture, developing countries were supposed to be given much more access to the markets of the developed countries. But again, frankly, there was just cheating. Particularly Canada, oddly enough, and Europe and the United States, they actually raised barriers to imports of agricultural products when they were supposed to reduce it. I'll get into that when we get to agriculture in more detail, but I think it left a very bad taste in the mouths of the developing countries. They felt, look, the developed countries made these promises and they said they'd open up the areas of interest to us, textiles and agriculture, and in practice they didn't. And I think that's one of the underlying problems now, and the reason for the division between these two groups.
Okay, Manu?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's take one more question, and then we'll
Exactly.
let all the participants eat and get some rest. And
Yes, absolutely.
And we'll be able to open the discussion up again tomorrow after a session.
Sure. We have Athar, and Athar, this will be the last question, and then we can all say bye to each other. So Athar, please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, sir. One of my questions was about the national security exceptions. We looked at the other exception under Article 20, which can be questioned. Can the exception under national security also be questioned by the appellate body?
Well, that's a great question, and that's frankly up in the air at this point. Let's go back and just look at the language. So the U.S. position in the Helms-Burton case, and it will be their position in the current cases against steel and aluminum, a member may take action it considers necessary. That's it. If we think it's necessary, if we say it's necessary, you can't judge us. So that's their position. On the other hand, there's been one case interpreting this recent case, Ukraine and Russia, and they didn't look at the question of whether it considers. I mean, you could argue, and I would argue, that the word reasonably must be interpreted there. It reasonably considers necessary. I mean, take my bubblegum example. Could you really say it's necessary for protection? Could you reasonably say that we consider that necessary? Of course not. It's pure protection. But what they did in this Ukraine-Russia case, which was very interesting, they said, well, it considers, well, we don't get into that, but in time of war or other emergency, you've got to have that situation before you can take action under Article 21. And we can consider that. Is there a war or other emergency? So, and they said, as I said in that case, they said, yes, that criteria is met here because Russia has sent troops into Ukraine. But the key point is, they said that is something that the panels, the appellate body can consider. And which, the US is obviously very, very upset by that, because I think it's going to be hard for them to justify aluminium. I was saying aluminum. I've been in America too long. The aluminium case and the steel case, I think it'd be much harder to say that there's an emergency in international relations. I'm not sure what the emergency is. Certainly not. We're not at war with Mexico and Canada, and we've imposed restrictions on them. So that does that answer the question?
Yes, sir. It definitely does to an extent. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a key question. I mean, absolutely. As I said, if the appellate body, if it comes into action again, rules in favor of the United States, it just opens up. Anybody could really do anything and say national security, and you can't consider it. But this panel decision in Ukraine, Russia is very important and not good for the United States.
Great. Thanks, Patrick, for answering that question. And with that question, we can conclude today's session and discussion, and we'll be looking forward to have you all for tomorrow. And I think Spencer is speaking tomorrow on.
Yes, and then
Not sure on what he's speaking. I think, yeah, subsidies. And Patrick is there with trade remedy.